The events unfold at an international airport, where the protagonist is met by a research group already assembled for a tour. They were delighted to see Zhang Li, and one of the guys even complimented his appearance. Once everyone was gathered, the tour guide announced the departure and promised to explain everything along the way. Halfway to their destination, a stranger struck up a conversation with Zhang Li, inquiring about his profession. The young man was a medical student, and for someone specializing in archaeology, this seemed a bit unusual. The protagonist explained that Ebiz had fascinated him since childhood, so he had been eagerly waiting for the opportunity to visit. Ebiz is an ancient civilization formed over 5,000 years ago, but it mysteriously disappeared about 1,500 years ago. Recently, the shifting sands of the desert had settled, revealing part of the ruins of an ancient city, and archaeologists believe this could be the royal capital of Ebiz. Zhang Li was thrilled to witness his dream come to life, yet he had no inkling that his fate would soon become entwined with this enigmatic land. Night was approaching, and the ruins were so vast that the young man accidentally became separated from his tour group. Zhang Li attempted to get a mobile signal, but in vain, so he continued searching, until he stumbled upon tomb raiders engrossed in their illicit activities. Realizing the situation was turning dire, the young man decided to quietly slip away and call the police later. However, the raiders didn't let him do so. One of them silently crept up from behind and struck the blonde on the head with a heavy object. Zhang Li lost consciousness, and when he came to, he had no idea where he was, for there was nothing but pitch-black darkness around him. Trying to stand up, he bumped his head against a stone lid. Before he could fully comprehend the situation, he heard voices outside discussing how they had sealed him in a sarcophagus. A wave of genuine panic washed over the protagonist, and with all his might, he began pounding his fists against the lid, hoping to shift it even slightly and escape to freedom. But it was all in vain, and soon blood began to pour from his shattered knuckles, spreading across the sarcophagus. The hieroglyphs it touched suddenly started to glow. The lid of the sarcophagus clicked, and Zhang Li finally saw the light. Pushing the lid aside, the blonde climbed out, discovering a stone statue before him. Curiosity got the better of him, so he approached it to take a closer look. It seemed almost lifelike, and the protagonist started to recall that he had seen it somewhere before. Snapping back to reality, Zhang Li bolted and hurried away, trying to find his way outside. The blood from his palms that had touched the statue caused its outer layer to slowly crack. When the face was completely freed from its peculiar bindings, the statue opened its eyes. Zhang Li, meanwhile, continued searching for an exit, but luck seemed to elude him, and he once again stumbled upon the treasure raiders. They couldn't fathom how the young man had escaped, so they decided to finish him off in their usual manner. The blonde knew he had to survive at any cost, and being a child raised in the mountains, he began to fight back. After stunning one of the attackers, he made a run for it, but his path was immediately blocked. Zhang Li couldn't stand a chance against a crowd of armed men, and he began to think that this might really be the end for him. When suddenly, the statue appeared out of nowhere to help him, swinging its sword at his assailants. In an instant, they were defeated, and the statue's face remained devoid of any emotion, except for coldness. Disbelieving his eyes, Zhang Li thought he had gone mad, which left him unable to move. Unexpectedly, the statue turned its gaze toward him, causing the blonde to fear that he might be next in line for some kind of execution. The figure sheathed its sword, then gently leaned forward and extended its hand toward the frightened young man. The protagonist closed his eyes, bracing for the worst, when suddenly he felt a gentle touch on his cheek. Slowly and with careful enunciation, the statue spoke, saying they hadn't seen each other in a long time, which left Zhang Li even more shocked. Though it was their first meeting, it marked the beginning of everything. A considerable amount of time had passed since the incident, and during one of his classes, the protagonist seemed to be in a trance, oblivious to those around him. Finally snapping out of it, he found himself face to face with a classmate asking for help, while the others suggested he should rest a bit more after the ill-fated trip. Zhang Li, with an awkward smile, insisted that there was no need, as his wound had already healed. After the incident, the protagonist had lost consciousness, later being found by his archaeological group, and a week later, he awoke. It was then that he learned the tomb raiders had been caught, and he was sent to a local hospital for treatment. In the end, it became clear that the young man had wandered into a part of the ruins that was not yet open to tourists. But the strangest part was that, when witnesses were questioned, it was revealed that no one had seen any human-shaped stone statues near the sarcophagus. Nevertheless, after this trip, Zhang Li began to have strange dreams. In them, a figure appeared, eerily similar to that stone statue. Moreover, he constantly felt as if someone was watching him closely, making him wonder if he was just becoming paranoid. The protagonist was bewildered, unable to understand what was happening to him. Lost in thought, he failed to notice a car speeding toward him. At the very last moment, he was shoved out of the way, narrowly avoiding the accident and death. Turning around to thank his rescuer, Zhang Li found himself staring at the very same statue he had seen that day. Shock and confusion were mirrored on both of their faces. The protagonist remembered that in the Ebiz ruins it had not harmed him, but now it had suddenly appeared and saved him, which seemed strange in every possible way. With animated gestures, the statue seemed to be trying to say something, but it couldn't. It had no voice. Zhang Li was eager to finally learn the truth, but all his hopes were dashed in an instant. No matter how hard the figure tried, it couldn't produce a single sound, let alone speak any words. Suddenly, Zhang Li's friend appeared out of nowhere, wondering why the young man was sitting on the ground. The statue fled before it could be seen, and the blonde began to think that perhaps he had imagined it all. Accepting his friend's help, the young man stood up, still glancing warily around. Seeing nothing and no one strange, he sighed in disappointment and followed his companion. Upon returning home, Zhang Li found a peculiar gift at his doorstep, an assortment of fruits, flowers, and a frog. Turning his head to the side, he spotted a pair of ears sticking out from the bushes. It immediately became clear who was responsible. So, humming to himself, the blonde entered his home, pretending not to know who might have left these offerings. Sometime later, it began to rain, and the statue, having emerged from the bushes, sat on the doorstep where the fruits had been, curling up its legs. Despite its origins, the figure was freezing when suddenly, the door to the house creaked open, inviting it inside. The hallway was engulfed in darkness, which Zhang Li took advantage of, swiftly grabbing the statue and pinning it against the wall. He didn't waste any time and immediately began interrogating it about what it wanted from him and who the man really was. For added effect, he held the previously left frog close to the figure's face, attempting to intimidate it. Once again, the statue began gesturing frantically, and the protagonist finally realized that it was unable to speak. Grabbing the figure's hand, Zhang Li led it to the bathroom, where he dried it off from the rain. To his surprise, its hair was soft, and the skin that felt like stone was not rough. However, its tongue and vocal cords had turned completely to stone, making it no wonder that it couldn't speak. Externally, the statue was entirely solid, yet it had soft inner tissues and was capable of agile movement. Staring at the being before him, Zhang Li had no idea who or what it was, but it clearly showed interest and friendliness. The young man allowed the statue to stay for the night, but who could have predicted that one night would turn into 2, then a week, and eventually a whole month? However, the fact that the figure was nearby didn't seem so bad. On the contrary, the blonde felt safer with it around. While studying records on ancient Egypt, Zhang Li discovered that in Ebiz, death held great significance. Many hoped to be resurrected through certain rituals or spells. As he turned a page in the book, the young man noticed a flower petal planted by the stone statue. Since the moment the statue had settled in the protagonist's home, 2 months had flown by, and Zhang Li had witnessed with his own eyes how it had planted seeds in a pot. So he decided he should praise it for its diligence. Rising from his desk, the blonde approached the statue and gently patted its shoulder in consolation. The flower had begun to wilt, which visibly saddened the figure. The protagonist suggested they go out to lift their spirits, and soon, the two were strolling across the lawn behind the university's academic building, where a serene silence prevailed. Noticing how the man kept his distance, the blonde asked if everything was all right, but he received no answer. Instead, he noticed the statue's eyes turning a deep crimson. Wanting to help, Zhang Li stepped closer, only to be suddenly knocked to the ground. The frenzied statue sank its teeth into the tender flesh of his neck, terrifying the protagonist. Mustering all his strength, the blonde shoved the man away, and when he regained his senses, he realized the horror of what he had done. Seeing no better option, the statue attempted to flee, but the young man managed to grab a piece of its clothing, commanding it to stop. He pleaded not to be abandoned, then lost consciousness. The man caught Zhang Li just before he collapsed. After this incident, the young man was bedridden with a fever for a week, his mind clouded. Occasionally, he would open his eyes and always see the statue by his side. But over time, it began to feel as if everything was just a dream. In the end, Zhang Li constantly felt that the man wanted to leave him. One day, upon awakening, the protagonist found no one by his side. This greatly upset him, but he didn't intend to search for the statue, knowing that it would still be watching over him, lurking nearby as before. The young man couldn't understand why the man was avoiding him, and one day an idea struck him on how to force the statue to appear. Plunging into a deep body of water, Zhang Li began to drown, silently counting to 3. Just as he expected, the man appeared to save him. Pulling the blonde from the water, he was about to flee again when the young man grabbed him tightly, preventing him from leaving. The protagonist was determined to find out why the statue was avoiding him, so he led the man to a quieter place. Suddenly, the statue pulled its hand free from his grip, and Zhang Li finally noticed cracks on its stone wrists. Frightened, the blonde lunged at the statue, forcing it to yield, and discovered a hole in its chest, revealing a crimson stone resembling a heart. The young man began bombarding the man with questions: where, how, and when, but received only silence in return, until it dawned on him that this was a consequence of the madness that had manifested so suddenly. Zhang Li noticed the change in the statue's expression, instantly realizing that his suspicions were correct. The man, seeing the blonde's dejection, tried to cheer him up, once again gesturing animatedly, pretending that everything was fine. However, it was all in vain, as the protagonist was far more serious. He understood that the man had fled because he didn't want Zhang Li to witness his death. Guessing that a bite might help resolve the situation, as it had before, the young man suggested that the statue bite him to heal its wounds. The man almost agreed, but then memories of Zhang Li's horrified expression during the first time flashed through his mind. Pushing the young man away, he forced a fake smile, as if to indicate there was nothing to worry about. This only deepened the protagonist's sorrow, as he couldn't understand why the statue was refusing. Trying to change the mood as much as possible, the man suddenly remembered the flower he had been growing and the accessory he had crafted from its petals specifically for Zhang Li. He carefully clipped it onto the young man's ear, but it was immediately brushed aside. Annoyed, the blonde declared that he didn't like such things at all and that he also didn't care for stud earrings. Not wanting to see the man any longer, Zhang Li walked away, leaving him to his fate. Left alone, the statue gently knelt down and picked up the discarded accessory, hiding it in his hands. Not considering the consequences at the time, the protagonist soon slowed his pace, gradually realizing the gravity of what he had done. Suddenly turning around, he sprinted back to where he had left the man, determined to make amends. Finding him sitting at the table, the young man stopped to catch his breath. Mustering his strength, Zhang Li slowly and somewhat hesitantly approached, apologizing for his harsh words and explaining that he had been overwhelmed with worry. He proposed that they try to figure out the situation together, and perhaps even reconsider the option of a bite. Hearing the familiar voice, the man stood up, smiling as he greeted the young man, but his condition had already deteriorated significantly. Right before their eyes, the statue began to crumble and disintegrate into tiny pieces. The feet were the first to go, and it collapsed directly into the terrified Zhang Li's arms, fully aware that this was the end. Looking up, the man never stopped smiling, grateful that in this final moment he wasn't alone. But the young man seemed on the verge of tears. With trembling hands, he tried in vain to halt the irreversible process, grasping the man's face, but it was all futile. The statue, having taken the earlier criticism to heart, had reworked the earring into a pendant while alone, and now it gently placed it around the blonde's neck. Feeling a deep sense of guilt within, Zhang Li exhaled heavily, clutching the pendant in his hands. Genuine words of gratitude escaped his lips. He turned his head to avoid the statue's gaze, but it wasn't the least bit offended and gently cupped his face, turning him back. The man's final wish was, in truth, a daring one, and the young man didn't resist, leaning in for a kiss. Yet, it was not meant to be. The statue crumbled and then evaporated, leaving behind only a crimson heart-shaped stone at Zhang Li's feet. Tears streamed down the protagonist's face, dripping onto the precious stone, which he gently picked up. Clutching it to his chest, all the young man wished for was a miracle, to see the statue once more. The stone glowed brightly, as if hearing his wish, and had Zhang Li known what would come of it, he would have never spoken his desire aloud. The light was so blinding that the blonde didn't immediately grasp what was happening, but as soon as he opened his eyes, he found himself face to face with a dark-haired man who bore a striking resemblance to the statue. Unable to believe this was really happening, Zhang Li jumped up, reaching out to him. Unaware of any danger, the protagonist embraced his beloved tightly, only to be rejected in the very next instant. The man, assuming the blonde was an assassin, ordered his immediate arrest. In the blink of an eye, Zhang Li was bound and surrounded by spears, leaving him no chance to escape. Stone stele adorned with Ebiz-era motifs, frescoes on the walls, imperial guards in elaborate garments. All of it was indeed Ebiz, and this dark-haired man before him was its king. The protagonist couldn't comprehend how the stone statue could be the ruler of an entire country. The statue that had once stood before the sarcophagus was now a king, and Zhang Li refused to believe it. He was asked what he was doing in the palace, and though he wanted to reply, he fell silent. Under no circumstances could he reveal that he had come from the future, or he would be deemed an outsider and sentenced to death. Zhang Li hadn't traveled back in time just to die, so he resolved to tread carefully. He realized that he had been transported to the time of the statue's human life solely because his heart had desperately longed to see him again. But now the man had no memory of him. It is hard to change a person's nature. The stone statue had been gentle and sincere, but now he was a king. And to him, the protagonist was nothing more than a stranger. So Zhang Li couldn't fault him for acting so guardedly. Deep down, Zhang Li hoped that perhaps they could grow close again. He didn't want to endure the pain of losing his beloved once more. Rising from his throne, the king approached the stranger and extended his hand. Zhang Li remembered how the statue had once done the same in that other reality, and he thought the man recognized him, so he extended his hand in return. However, the king's outstretched hand wasn't for the stranger, but for a servant, who handed him a blade with a golden hilt. The dark-haired man was surprised by the young man's gesture, then smirked slyly, clearly plotting something. No one understood how it happened, but in the next moment, the blade was plunged into the blonde's hand, and just as quickly withdrawn, leaving a severe wound. According to the king, this was punishment for failing to understand his current predicament. The man was also irritated by the stranger's gaze, so he suggested gouging out the prisoner's crimson eyes, menacingly bringing the blade to his face. Zhang Li was genuinely terrified for his life, and it was sheer luck that the king reconsidered killing him, instead tossing the sharp weapon somewhere behind him. Giving orders to his subordinates, the man left the palace, not forgetting to mention that they could do whatever was necessary to make the prisoner talk. It finally dawned on the protagonist that the person before him was not the same stone statue he had once known. Zhang Li couldn't comprehend how someone who had once protected and cared for him could have changed so drastically. After being thrown into a cell, Zhang Li passed out, later waking up from a nightmare that replayed the earlier events. Sitting up, the blonde grabbed his head, which had clearly been struck hard, and then noticed his clean clothes and the treated wound, which fortunately wasn't too severe. Guards stood outside, and the protagonist didn't know what to do next. He had been deemed a murderer and arrested, and the person he had so desperately wanted to see was no longer the same as before. Zhang Li had thought that meeting him after the time shift was a miracle, but it now felt more like a punishment. And now, for missing his chance and failing to protect that stone statue, he had to deal with a despot. As if mentally addressing the man, the blonde wished they would never meet again in the future. For every time he looked at him, it only deepened his sorrow. At this moment, the protagonist needed to find a way to survive. And whether he returned to the modern era or remained in Ebiz, survival was his primary goal. The first thing Zhang Li tried was to escape through the door. But just as he approached it, a red-haired man named Ebiz opened it. Growing bolder, Ebiz began approaching the prisoner closer and closer, while Zhang Li, now backed up against a table, had nowhere left to go. Wrapping an arm around Zhang Li, the redhead almost sang as he announced that the king had placed the blonde under his care. However, Ebiz wasn't pleased that the blonde had attempted to escape. The protagonist was momentarily taken aback, but then quickly assessed the situation and decided to play the fool, to see what would happen next. Pushing Ebiz away, Zhang Li claimed that he had lost his memory and could hardly remember anything, causing the redhead to look visibly stunned. It seemed as though Ebiz believed the prisoner's act, but that was only on the surface. In reality, Ebiz immediately saw through the ruse, realizing that Zhang Li was pretending and even overacting, so he decided to play along for some amusement. Both of them found the situation increasingly nauseating, yet they continued to pretend that everything was as it should be. Changing the subject, Evetiti pulled out a pendant from his cloak, one that had once belonged to Zhang Li. Of course, the blonde wanted to reclaim it, but doing so would blow his cover, so he continued to play the part of someone with amnesia. To test whether the prisoner was lying, Evetiti threw the pendant out the door and then left, telling Zhang Li to call for him when he remembered anything. Left alone, Zhang Li waited a few minutes before rushing to the closed door and trying to retrieve the pendant through the gap at the bottom. The protagonist sincerely hoped he had escaped detection. After all, he was close to losing the only item that reminded him of the stone statue. But his deception was ultimately exposed as his hand was boldly pinned down by Evetiti's foot, who had been standing nearby all along, watching to see what the prisoner would do. Opening the door, the man took the pendant for himself, causing Zhang Li to become furious, demanding its return. The blonde swung to hit the redhead, but at that moment, the guards arrived, grabbing him and holding him immobile. Evetiti was both surprised and amused by the show the prisoner had put on. Such entertainment was a rare find, so for him, this was a form of enjoyment as well. The king had been observing the scene from a distance, but as soon as Evetiti noticed him, the man immediately turned away and left, as if uninterested in the conflict. Evetiti ordered Zhang Li to be chained up and a pitcher of water brought to him. No matter how much noise he made, the guards were instructed to ignore him, but most importantly, they were to keep a constant watch on him. In his helpless position, the protagonist was furious with Evetiti, but all he could do now was sit and wait. Seeing the king sitting on the steps near the prisoner's cells, the redhead became curious about what he was doing there. The king ordered him to leave, but Evetiti, of course, didn't budge, instead starting a conversation about the strange young man who had appeared out of nowhere at such a peculiar time. Just as the king ordered the sacred stone stele at the main gates to be torn down, the young man had suddenly appeared only 3 meters behind the ruler. Evetiti offered a few theories about who the young man might be and why he had appeared, but the king wasn't listening. Instead, the king took out the crimson stone, declaring that it was the work of the faithful. Evetiti chuckled and then asked a rather logical question about why the young man was receiving so much attention when he could have simply been killed, like all the others. The ruler hesitated before replying irritably that the man was behaving strangely and was clearly hiding something, and the king was curious to find out what. Evetiti recalled how the young man had first rushed to embrace the king and then tried to kiss him, so all questions vanished in an instant. Rising from the steps, the king ordered that the blonde be kept under strict surveillance. Before Evetiti could say goodbye to the king, one of the guards suddenly ran up, informing them that the prisoner had taken his own life. On the way to the cell, the servant explained that the young man had smashed the water pitcher and used one of the shards for an entirely different purpose. He had taken another guard hostage and demanded to see the leader, using the excuse that he had committed suicide. Arriving at the scene, Evetiti indeed found the subordinate held hostage. Zhang Li declared himself a man blessed by God, and the mission he had come on did not concern the locals. The young man demanded first the return of his pendant, and second, his freedom and an end to the spying on him. At first, Evetiti was taken aback, but then he grew angry and was ready to attack the audacious man with his fists. However, the young man continued his speech, insisting that he was a man blessed by God, and if his demands were not met, they would incur divine wrath. Zhang Li claimed that he would summon fire to demonstrate his power, and at that very moment, the grass behind Evetiti burst into flames. This made the man pause and seriously consider the situation, while the protagonist let out a sigh of relief, even if only for a moment. He had previously placed a convex lens from the bottom of the pitcher in the bushes, and then, using the hostage as cover, he had discreetly held a shard from the same pitcher with water droplets on it over the lens until the fire ignited strongly enough. The young man knew that the people of Ebiz were devout believers, so he hoped to use their faith as a pretext to deceive them. Evetiti laughed, saying that perhaps he really shouldn't mistreat the prisoner anymore. But suddenly, a couple of dozen archers appeared behind him, aiming their arrows directly at Zhang Li. Evetiti hated being blackmailed, so he gave the order to shoot. Zhang Li tried to stop the man from making a rash decision, but it was too late. He couldn't understand what he had done wrong or where he had failed, that they didn't believe him. Covering the hostage with his own body, the protagonist sacrificed himself to save him. However, a moment later, he realized that he was still alive, and Evetiti was leaning over him, amazed by such selflessness. Evetiti had thought that, in the last moment, the prisoner would reveal some hidden power, or that an extraordinary force would suddenly protect him. But in the end, nothing happened. Turning over, Zhang Li discovered that the arrows had no tips. Unexpectedly, Ebiz returned the pendant to its owner, but the young man couldn't understand why or for what reason. It turned out to be simpler than he imagined, because none of the arrows had hit the guard. Reunited with his comrades, the guard grumbled about being left out of the plan, while the others merely laughed at his reaction. It's impossible to predict how someone will act in a critical moment, but after all this, Ebiz finally managed to catch a glimpse of the young man's true nature. So he extended his hand, inviting Zhang Li to accompany him. Ebiz's patience wasn't limitless, and he urged the blonde to decide quickly. Zhang Li, of course, agreed, unaware of what this cunning fox had in store for him. The man agreed to the blonde's terms. First, he returned the pendant, and second, he granted him freedom. But Zhang Li also had to do something for him in return. Ebiz ordered his servants to clean Zhang Li up and then send him to the archives. Though this wasn't the kind of freedom the young man had in mind, and he even tried to rebel, it was still better than nothing. In the archives, the redhead sat him down to read scrolls, but Zhang Li couldn't understand a single hieroglyph. Naturally, Ebiz had expected the young man to be literate, but it turned out to be the exact opposite, which frustrated him immensely. Suddenly, an archivist burst into the room, reporting problems, but seeing the prisoner at a workstation, he was momentarily taken aback. Ebiz suggested that the young man explain what had happened himself, but Zhang Li chose to remain silent. Zhang Li couldn't believe that Ebiz actually thought he wanted to be there, so he didn't pay much attention to the conversation happening just a few meters away. Then, the man suddenly suggested he visit the potato storage to find a case related to an investigation. After Ebiz explained where the building was, Zhang Li was indeed allowed to go there on his own. He suspected that Ebiz was testing him again and that someone was probably watching him right now. However, Zhang Li had no interest in stealing any official documents. His only goal was freedom. Playing out another scene, he faked his own suicide. Removing his outer clothing, the protagonist threw it out of the building. The person who had been tailing him fell for it and rushed to save him, while Zhang Li took advantage of the situation and knocked the man out with a stone to the head. After changing into the other man's clothes, the protagonist realized that he had no money, and the decorations on the uniform were clearly not made of gold. He considered obtaining a few gold bars, but decided not to risk venturing into the throne room or royal chambers. It was better to stay away to avoid unnecessary questions. He couldn't return to the archives either, but fortunately, the blonde knew the exact location of a place in the middle of nowhere, where no one is around. Arriving at the potato storage tent, Zhang Li rummaged through the documents for a long time but couldn't find anything of value. He was about to conclude that coming here was a waste when he suddenly noticed a light burning behind a partition. In the man's hands was a golden object, a lamp, which the young man decided to borrow immediately, justifying it by saying that he couldn't see well and needed the light. He promised to return it as soon as he found the document he needed, but the stranger was in no hurry to help him. Already on the brink of despair, Zhang Li was disappointed that he would have to resort to dirty tactics. But unexpectedly, the lamp ended up in his hands. The protagonist's mood shifted instantly. He was already making plans to leave the Palace of Corrupt Hearts. But the stranger who had lent him the lamp turned out to be the king himself, causing the young man to freeze in horror, holding his breath in shock. Zhang Li was so terrified of the man that he dropped the lamp, taking several steps back. The dark-haired man was slightly disappointed by the behavior of Ebiz's new servant, but he didn't seem particularly angry. In the end, he merely asked for his name. The protagonist was incredibly fortunate that the king didn't recognize him, allowing him to continue playing his role and introduce himself with a completely fake name. Feeling utterly awkward and dreadful, Zhang Li was about to leave. But there was one thing that had always intrigued him. Unable to resist, he asked in return what the man's name was, which elicited a look of extreme surprise. The blonde had already begun to think he had uttered yet another provocative question. But the king decided to play along, giving a name that alluded to cats. Zhang Li realized that the man was lying to him as well, and he wanted to protest, but instead bent down to pick up the lamp, which the king had politely reminded him about. The protagonist continued to diligently pretend he was searching for a specific scroll, when suddenly the king blurted out that the scroll he needed was right in his hands. Zhang Li had no desire to get closer to the despot, but the situation left him no choice. Before he could react, the man was beside him, offering to teach him how to read. This after Zhang Li had awkwardly explained that he couldn't read the scroll. The protagonist couldn't believe this was actually happening, but he kept playing his role, nodding and agreeing with the king on almost everything. The man became so engrossed in his role as a teacher that he didn't notice how Zhang Li was staring at him, too mesmerized to even blink. Zhang Li finally saw a different side of the king, one that didn't match the image he had seen before. This man was far more complex than he appeared at first glance, and the protagonist couldn't tell if he was pretending to be someone else, or if this was his true self.